Y'all ready to get started?
So it's just this top one.
Side to side, and this is the pointer.
Oh, got it. Hi, everybody. Can y'all hear me? Yes? No? Am I not on?
That one should be on. Let's see the other one. Yeah, that one's on. That one's on. It's just not.
Hello?
Yeah,
Is that better?
Here?
Better? Yeah? How about now? Yeah? Okay. You just told me how to pronounce your name, and I'm gonna Trizzle, Dr. Trizzle. As he said, I'm a professor at West Virginia University, but I am not a professor of medicine of any sort. I'm actually a journalism professor. So, understand, where I'm coming from with this. I'm not here to lecture you about medicine or anything. I'm here to tell you a story about something that happened in the field of medicine that is one of sort of the root stories, one of the origin stories, I think, of the epidemic that we're facing today. This is such an amazing opportunity for me because, I talk to a lot of audiences, but whenever I get a chance to talk to medical students, I feel like, I'm really making an impact, hopefully, because, if you can sort of, develop your own ideas and ways of handling this, I mean, it's really going to be up to you to figure out, where to go next with this. Last night I was at a hotel on the other side of the tunnel, and I struck up a conversation with an older couple, and they asked me, eventually asked me what I was doing here, and I told them about my book and the speech, and as almost always is the case, they had their own personal story to tell about their connection to opioid abuse. The woman, her name is Donna, she's in her 60s, had fallen a couple of years back and broke her clavicle. And she got a pretty massive dose of, she had to have several surgeries, had a lot of nerve pain in her left arm, and she had to, her doctor gave her a prescription. She had a pain management doctor in addition to the rest of her doctors, and the pain management doctor gave her a very large prescription for hydrocodone. And she is one of the lucky people who took some hydrocodone and didn't like it. The unlucky people are the people who take it and like it, which is a larger percentage, I think, of people. She didn't like it, it made her woozy, drowsy, groggy. She's an active person. She wanted to be out doing stuff, and so she decided, I'm just going to take as little as possible. She didn't know anything about the addictive, nature of the drug or anything like that. She just didn't like the way it made her feel. So she took one pill a day at night in order to sleep, and would go back to her doctor, her pain management doctor, and she said he was an older gentleman getting close to retirement, and he kept pushing her to take more. He kept saying, I don't want you to feel any pain. That's the quote that she said to me. She said, I was so confused by that. Why would he care that much if I was making a decision not to take this drug? Why would he be pushing it on me? But he had been trained as, I have a lot of friends who are doctors who are around my age, and they all came of age in medical school during a time when there was a lot of talk about you've got to load patients up on opioids so that they don't have breakthrough pain and all of these things. The biggest fear in the world seemed to be pain at that point. Like if you had even pain that you weren't feeling yet, you wanted to make sure that you were heavily dosed enough not to have it, down the road. So anyway, Donna continued to take her one pill a day. She just didn't like it, so she only took one a day. Again, didn't know anything about all this. That doctor retired. She got a new pain management doctor, and she went in, and this was a younger guy, I think, and she explained to him that she was only, I think maybe he knew that she was only taking 1 pill a day, and he was very aggressive with her and said, why are you only taking 1 pill a day? Are you selling those drugs? Are you selling, what are you doing with the surplus? And she said she cried on the way home because she felt like a criminal in there. And he said, are you hoarding those drugs? Are you on heroin? He really grilled her. So this was a doctor, completely unlike the other doctor, who was very aware of the drug epidemic and probably was dealing with all kinds of patients from this previous practice who were struggling with these drugs. And he couldn't believe that there was someone who was just sort of taking 1 pill a day and making do with that and not wanting more and more and more. It just struck me the difference between those two approaches. Neither of them feels quite right to me, at all. I mean, they both sort of feel difficult. Anyway, the next time she went to see that doctor, or I think actually like the next day, she drove into him because she couldn't get it out of her mind. She brought all her leftover pills. She had 605 hydrocodone pills. And she presented them to this guy and was like, that's what I've done with these pills. They're sitting in my medical closet. By the way, on the street, those pills would be worth a lot of money. So she's lucky that no one found out that she was not using those pills because the drug addicts have all kinds of ways of finding this out. Now, I might mention a couple of those techniques that you wouldn't think of unless you were desperate for drugs. But anyway, so the doctor, of course, was completely chastened, and she said that now she's his favorite patient, so and his hero. So, but apparently it's extremely rare to find someone like Donna who, from that doctor's point of view at least, was able to just sort of self-regulate and give herself the right amount. And initially, she was vastly overprescribed, it sounds like. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. So I am going to tell the story of what happened in Florida when the opioid epidemic was taking law enforcement and the medical profession by surprise. So most of this story takes place between the years 2008 and 2010. Now, the epidemic was well underway at that point, and this was not the first time that a pill mill had ever existed or anything, but there were some things that were different, and there was an order of magnitude with American pain that happened. So I am, as I said, I'm a journalist and an author of several books, and I didn't set out to write about criminal justice, but it seems to be sort of where I always head, when I'm coming up with a new book. But as a so all of my books have to do with crime, criminals, the legal system, and several of them have to do with the medical system. So I have two sons, 12 and 15, so they always grow up with my latest book, and we're always talking about it. So they know way more than they should about heroin and pills and criminals, and they're used to me getting phone calls during dinner from inmates of the whatever federal prison. So my younger son, I wanted to show you this, took a stab when we were putting together the book. He took a stab at doing the jacket cover. This was when he was about 8 years old. Oh, there we go. Okay, so that's my younger son, and this is the jacket cover that he came up with. And so it's a pain clinic, and the way you can tell that it's a pain clinic is, of course, they had a big sign saying pain clinic. In South Florida Pain Clinic, and you can tell it's in Florida because this is a palm tree. And then you can also tell it's a pain clinic because these are lots and lots of cars, right? Jammed into one tiny parking lot. And if you could look really closely at those cars, all of those cars would have out-of-state license plates because everyone drove from a long way to go to this pain clinic. So anyway, I did send it to the publisher, and they rejected it and went with the other one. So yeah. But I feel good that my sons know a lot about this subject because they are scared to death to ever, take any drugs, I think, at this point. Okay, so I was interested in this topic. I'm in West Virginia, which is one of the few states that has a drug problem that is worse than your state's drug problem. So we're number one in that regard. But I've seen this develop. I've been there since 2002, and I've just watched it get worse and worse and worse. And I started hearing in the mid-aughts about prescription drug abuse. And I didn't even know what it was. I thought it had something to do with prescription drug policy or something. I didn't even understand what it was for several years because it's such a benign sounding term. It's so, it just doesn't sound like a big deal, prescription drug abuse. It was probably a term developed and marketed by the pharmaceutical industry for that reason. But I kept seeing references to this, and then I started seeing it in my personal life. Students of mine, normal, average, everyday college students coming to me and saying, yeah, I have a heroin addiction, or I have they just drop out of sight and they'd say, yeah, I'm in rehab for an opioid addiction. It didn't happen often, but it happened like once a year. And I just thought, these are the students who are coming to me. That must be the tip of the iceberg. And since when did college students develop opioid addictions? That was not even a thing. Heroin, when I was growing up, was demographically sort of in certain categories. It was sort of a bottom of the barrel drug. So I was just very curious about this. Where did this come from, and why did it seem to be hitting West Virginia so hard? So when I saw a story about a pain clinic in Florida that had made just millions and millions of dollars and was run by criminals and just had all these crazy characteristics, I thought that's a good way to tell this story and look into this bigger story. Because at the point when I started working on American Pain, which was around 2012, the first thing I always do when I start to write a book is I look to see what else is out there in a journalistic, are there other journalistic books on this subject? And there was plenty of people concerned about the opioid epidemic, plenty of people writing about it in newspapers and magazines and obviously medical journals and whatnot, but no one had written a sort of general audience journalistic book on the subject, except for one, a book called Painkiller by Barry Meyer. He's a New York Times reporter, and it came out in 2004. And so it's a book that you should read, and it was about the Purdue Pharma and how they marketed and released and turned OxyContin into a blockbuster drug, the first big blockbuster painkiller. So really good book, but it was the only one I could find. And I thought, this is crazy. This is the deadliest drug epidemic in history, and there are no books on it. Since my books, before, and now there are some books, and there's so much more attention being paid now than there was in 2012, so that has definitely changed. But at that point, I just thought, am I just misreading all this? But anyway, I dove in and started to learn what I could. So these are the two guys who started American Pain. They're brothers, twin brothers. The serious one is Chris George. And these are police mugshots from when they were like 25. And so the one who thinks that it's okay to smile for your police mugshot is his crazy brother, Jeff. So Chris was the more serious one. They were both, they grew up in a wealthy family. Their father was a home builder down in South Florida, and he, they kind of had a lot of everything. Not that that's, why they went wrong or anything, but they were sort of wild boys from the beginning. They started getting into trouble with the police when they were like 12, doing small things, and continued on getting arrested every couple of years and kind of, got their way out of things. Jeff, I think at one point stole or maybe it was Chris, now I'm blanking, but stole a police motorcycle at one point, took it for a joyride, things like that. But the big thing that happened to Chris was when he was 21, they got into weightlifting, bodybuilding. You can kind of see when your neck is like wider than your head, you might be on steroids. And they were both really into steroids, and Chris began sort of selling steroids on the side to friends of his who were into bodybuilding. And he eventually got busted doing that. And I'm forgetting the exact circumstances, but he was sentenced to 8 months in prison on a felony drug charge for distributing steroids, anabolic steroids. So he served about 6 months of that time. And when he got out, he kind of settled down a little bit, went to work for his father. Neither of them, they both went to college briefly and took a few classes, decided it wasn't for them, and decided to do other stuff. So they had no, college degrees or anything like that. They certainly didn't have any medical experience. But Jeff was undeterred by Chris's arrest, but he kind of wanted to go straight with the steroid thing. So they, in addition to working for their father and building homes, Jeff created a steroid clinic. And it was a telemedicine clinic, which is apparently you call the doctor and you tell him you need steroids, and then he sends you some. It was sort of their model. And they would advertise in bodybuilding magazines and those kinds of things. So they got to know some doctors who weren't, at the top of their game, ethically speaking, through this. And one of those doctors was Dr. William Overstreet, and he, this guy right here. And at one point, he came to Chris and Jeff around 2007 when the housing market was just crashing in Florida, and they were losing business, and the company was their father's home building company was headed toward bankruptcy. Dr. Overstreet came to them and said, the real money is not in steroids. That's a niche market. The real money is in painkillers. So the brothers didn't know anything about painkillers. They weren't drug users other than steroids. And they sort of took him at his word, though, and they said, well, what do you need to get started? And he said, I want to have my own pain clinic, and you guys can fund it. He didn't want to do anything but write the prescriptions, and he wanted the brothers to sort of fund it, set up the business, figure out how to get the drugs from pharmaceutical wholesalers, and he would just sit in the office and see patients and write them prescriptions. And they were like, okay, we'll try it. So they set up a shop in a sort of seedy stretch of Fort Lauderdale, and tiny little place, and they went in and did the work on it themselves, opened it up, and almost immediately were just bombarded with patients. Like the word got around. There was a doctor who was willing to write big prescriptions for almost nothing. Now, Dr. Overstreet had his own drug problems, which is often the case with overt criminality with doctors. There's usually some problem that they have in their lives that is causing them to do this kind of thing. So lines out the door. So they were actually not only seeing patients and writing prescriptions, but they had their own pharmacy, these guys. And so they would fill the prescription right there. So it was sort of this one-stop shop, and they were very quickly seeing 60, 70 patients a day, and things were just sort of out of control. They'd opened up this thing not knowing what they would get, and all of a sudden, boom, it's this place where they've got all this cash coming in. They took only cash. They wouldn't take insurance. They wouldn't take credit cards. They wouldn't take anything like that. It was just a cash business. So yeah, a lot of money and a lot of drugs lying around and a lot of drug addicts coming in. So you need a guy like this. This is Derek Nolan, and he was one of their buddies. He was a plumber and kind of a tough guy who the brothers knew. And they hired him for security and as the office manager. So he sort of organized the office. And he is actually the main character of American Pain, because he's actually, despite the way he looks here, quite an intelligent guy with a great memory and a way of and he was willing to sort of think through what had happened, and really was a rich source of information for me. So that's why I've included him here. So they started out with just Dr. Overstreet. 3 weeks into the practice, Dr. Overstreet went on vacation to Panama, and as I said, he's a drug addict. He ran his Jeep off the road and died. So Jeff and Chris were just starting to make a lot of money at this place, or specifically Chris. He'd kind of almost kicked Jeff out of the business at this point. So Chris was in a real dilemma. He was like, this is the greatest money-making scheme I've ever come across, and now I don't have a doctor to prescribe the drugs. What am I going to do? Well, that is when Chris had his big epiphany that it didn't matter as long as he could find other doctors. He could just have this business. So it didn't matter if doctors died. It didn't matter if doctors got busted by the DEA. It didn't matter if, what happened, if doctors quit on him. If he could find enough doctors to keep this place going, then he was the center of the business, but he was also sort of untouchable from a criminal standpoint. So he started hiring doctors. So here are a couple of the more prominent doctors that he hired. Dr. Cadet, Dr. Cynthia Cadet, right there, was a West Point graduate from West Point, from a prominent Haitian family. She was a major in the Air Force, went to med school at Cornell, and was an emergency medicine doctor before she went to work at American Pain. Dr. Joseph Castronuovo had many titles over a long career. He was chief of the Division of Nuclear Medicine for the North Shore University Hospital in Long Island, New York. He retired in, I think, 2003 or so, and moved down to Florida, as many doctors do. And then, of course, when the stock market crashed, he lost a lot of money, and he decided, I'm going to go back to work part-time, and he answered an ad and went to work for Chris George. So these two doctors were somewhat different than most of the doctors. As I said, most of the doctors had a sort of an overt drug problem. They were just sort of on the fringes of the medical community. I mean, they were doctors, barely sort of, they didn't have much going on in their careers. These two doctors had a little bit more going on, but they did have a range of doctors. It didn't matter what your specialty was to Chris George. He had gynecologists working for him. He had emergency medicine doctors. He had surgeons. He had all sorts of different doctors working for him. He didn't care about that. This is how the interviews went. First of all, when he had his big epiphany, like, I just need to hire doctors, he went to Derek and said, how do you think we should do this? And Derek said, well, in the past, when we're working on construction projects, I've found that Craigslist is an excellent place to recruit new talent. So they put an ad in Craigslist that basically read something like this: MDs needed $75 a patient DEA registration required. So, and believe it or not, they got responses to that. And pretty much anyone who was responding to that particular ad in Craigslist was not surprised or necessarily opposed to going to work at a place like American Pain. So that's kind of how that went down. And the interview process was no better. They didn't really like disguise the fact of what they were doing. They sort of, they never said, we are prescribing drugs to addicts. They didn't say anything like that, but they didn't sort of hide the seediness of the place or anything. They kind of wanted people to know what they were getting into. So, and what they were getting into was a place where just some of the details about the operation that sprung up. Some of the doctors carried guns because they were scared of the patients, because a patient would fly off the handle, at any little thing. There were lines out the door. And increasingly, one thing they noticed is that very few of their patients were actually from Florida. Not very few, but 20% or less were from Florida. And most of their patients were driving down from Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Ohio, Appalachian states. So that's, a 14, 16, 20-hour drive one way to go all the way down to South Florida to see the doctor. And so they would, when a patient would come to American Pain, they would go in, get signed in, and then they'd have a very short consultation with the doctor. The doctor would, in fact, ask them some medical questions and write some things down in a folder, and they created a folder. They decided that they needed to start creating patient folders and have record keeping and stuff like that. And then the patients would say, I have neck pain or I have back pain. They wouldn't come in and say, Doc, I'm addicted to drugs. I need drugs to feed my addiction. They would say, I have pain, and the doctor would say, okay. And then the doctor would write them a large amount of oxycodone. They sold mostly oxycodone and Xanax, which is a terrible combination of drugs in terms of that combination leads to a lot of overdoses. But that's what they sold. They didn't know what they were doing at that point. So it grew and it grew and it grew. So this was the place. So you can kind of recognize it from my son's jacket cover. And as you can see, by the way, this is just a Google Earth screen grab from 2008. This is the moment when the Google Earth truck happened to go past the place. And you can see, it's a little blurry, but you can see the parking lot is just jammed. There are several people waiting in a line out here. There's someone actually walking in the door at that moment. I think that's another person there. This is just full of trouble. The neighborhood where they were just became overrun with drug addicts and drug-seeking behavior, and people trading drugs and selling drugs in the parking lot and trading sex for drugs and all kinds of things like that were going on in this neighborhood, and the police could do nothing about it, or very little about it. They could arrest people for all of those peripheral crimes, but they couldn't stop the main problem, because the essential transaction that was going on in American Pain, which was initially called South Florida Pain, they changed the name eventually to American Pain. The essential transaction was a doctor who is licensed to prescribe controlled substances was prescribing controlled substances to a patient who was complaining of pain. And there's nothing that the local police can do about that. They're just not equipped to look into something like that. So what they would do is they would pull people over, they would who were leaving the place, they'd search their cars, they'd sort of keep an eye on the place. If someone was breaking into something around there, they'd try to get them. And increasingly, they sort of targeted people's pills. So if someone was leaving the clinic, they would pull them over and they would look at their prescription and see had they already given some of the pills to someone else. They could potentially arrest you for that. Did they have someone else's pill bottle with someone else's name on it? They could potentially arrest you for that. But if it was just a patient leaving with pills that they had been prescribed, there was very little they could do. However, it still, the neighborhood got too hot. It was not a place that they could continue to do business in for very long, so they had to keep moving. They moved 5 times in those 2 years, and each time they would get a bigger office. They'd have more doctors, they'd have more staff. They always wanted a bigger parking lot. They could never find a place with a big enough parking lot. But I wanted to show you first, so this is all taking place down in South Florida. And they were sort of jumping around from spot to spot between 2008 and 2010. Now, but like I said, most of their patients were from up here, our area. So just to give you a sense, 43% of their patients were from Kentucky, 20% of their patients were from Florida, 18% from Tennessee, 11% from Ohio. So 18% from Tennessee, 43% from Kentucky. So we were right in the heart of American pain country. And it became, so a whole sort of culture up here sprung up around this Florida pill pipeline. They started calling 75 the Blue Highway because the OxyContin pills, the oxycodone pills that American Pain sold were a generic blue 30 milligram oxycodone pill. And they happen to be blue. And that's the drug they always sold. So they started calling 75 the Blue Highway. So what you had was up where we are, there have always been families in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, who kind of ran the local criminal trade. Whether that was early on moonshining, later on marijuana, and then when pills became a big deal, certain families kind of began to sort of get their arms around the pill trade. And by that, what I mean is that most drug addicts in Appalachia are dirt poor. They've spent all their money on drugs. They don't have the money to travel down to Florida and go see a doctor and spend $500 to get drugs. So they need a sponsor. So families up here would sponsor them. They would give them the money to go see the doctor. They would pave the way through people like Derek Nolan at the pain clinics. They would drive them down. One of the people that I wrote about in the book was a 17-year-old girl from, she was from Louisville, and she began driving carloads of her friends and family down to Florida. She'd make that trip once a week, round trip down to Florida.